The crack of a rifle echoed across the hills, and Harriet Chambers lowered her smoking gun, watching as the coyote that had been stalking her chickens fled into the brush. At 32, she'd become an expert markswoman not by choice, but by necessity. 5 years, a widow on this harsh Montana Territory homestead had taught her that hesitation meant death, whether for her livestock or herself. The year was 1883, and the land Harriet fought daily to keep was both her prison and her salvation. 160 acres of rolling grassland, timber, and a clear running creek that had once represented a dream shared with her husband Thomas. Now it was just hers, a daily battle against nature, thieves, and the crushing weight of solitude. Harriet tucked a strand of copper hair that had escaped her practical bun back beneath her bonnet and returned to the chicken coop to collect the morning's eggs. The rising sun cast long shadows across the yard between her modest cabin and the barn. In the distance, the majestic Rocky Mountains stood as silent sentinels, indifferent to her struggles. Her calloused hands gathered the warm eggs carefully into her apron. Thomas had built this coop, like he had built everything on their homestead. Sometimes, she still found herself turning to share a thought with him, only to remember he was 5 years in the cold ground behind the house, taken by pneumonia during a particularly brutal winter. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Harriet stiffen. Visitors were rare and rarely welcome. She set the eggs inside the cabin door and retrieved her rifle from where she'd propped it against the porch post. A lone rider appeared over the rise of her road, tall in the saddle atop a handsome chestnut stallion. Harriet raised her rifle, not aiming but making its presence known. She'd learned that lesson early in her widowhood: show strength first, ask questions later. The stranger reined in his horse a respectful distance from her porch. He was tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by years of hard work. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat brim, but she could see a strong jaw dusted with several days' worth of beard. "Morning, madam," he called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I mean no trouble. State your business," Harriet replied, not lowering her rifle. The man removed his hat, revealing dark hair with hints of silver at the temples. His eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. "Name's Wade Blackwood. I'm looking for work in these parts. Heard in town you might need help with your spring planting." Harriet's eyes narrowed. "Who told you that?" "Mr. Simmons at the general store. Said you've been working this place alone since your husband passed." "Mr. Simmons talks too much," Harriet said curtly. "I don't need help." Wade Blackwood's eyes traveled over the homestead, taking in the leaning fence posts, the half-repaired barn roof, and the unplowed fields. His gaze returned to her face, not with pity, but with a kind of respectful assessment that nonetheless irritated her. "Have you ever had help before, madam?" "Since your husband died, I mean." The question struck Harriet like a physical blow. Of course she hadn't. There had been offers at first: neighbors, church folk, even the banker's son who had always had his eye on her land. But accepting help meant opening a door she couldn't afford to open. Help came with expectations, with judgment, with the assumption that a woman alone would eventually fail. "I've managed just fine," she said, her voice tight, "and I'll continue to do so." Wade nodded slowly, placing his hat back on his head. "I can see that. You've done a remarkable job." There was no condescension in his tone, only simple acknowledgement. But even the strongest person can use an extra pair of hands sometimes. Harriet's grip tightened on her rifle. Not this person. Wade didn't argue. He simply nodded again and gathered his reins. "If you change your mind, I'll be staying at the Miller place. Old Jacob took a fall last month and I'm helping get his spring planting done." "Jacob Miller accepted your help?" Harriet asked, surprised. Jacob was as stubborn and independent as they came. A smile touched Wade's lips. Well, his daughter insisted, said if he didn't get some help, they'd lose the farm. Harriet knew Mary Miller, a sensible woman who had returned from teaching in Denver to care for her aging father, if Mary trusted this stranger. "Good day, Mr. Blackwood," Harriet said firmly, ending the conversation. He tipped his hat. "Madam." With a gentle click of his tongue, he turned his horse and rode back down the road. Harriet watched until he disappeared over the rise, then lowered her rifle with hands that had inexplicably begun to tremble. Something about his question had unsettled her deeply. Had she ever had help? The answer was so obvious it shouldn't have affected her at all. Yet as she returned to her chores, the question echoed in her mind. Along with the quiet respect in those blue eyes, so different from the doubtful or covetous looks she usually received from men who passed through. That night, as Harriet sat alone at her table eating a simple supper of beans and corn bread, a spring storm blew in from the mountains. Rain lashed at the windows, and the wind howled through the gaps in the cabin's chinking that she hadn't had time to repair. She tried to focus on her mental list of tomorrow's tasks. Mend the chicken coop where a fox had tried to dig in, finish splitting the remaining firewood, begin turning the soil in the kitchen garden. But her thoughts kept returning to Wade Blackwood and his simple question. Had she ever had help? No, she hadn't, and her pride in that fact had sustained her through countless difficulties. But pride wouldn't fix the barn roof before the next rain, or plow the north field before planting time passed. Pride wouldn't keep the wolves both four-legged and two-legged from her door. A particularly fierce gust of wind rattled the cabin, and Harriet heard a crash from outside. She grabbed her lantern and her rifle and ventured onto the porch. In the driving rain, she could just make out that a section of the barn roof had finally given way, leaving a gaping hole where rain was now pouring in on her precious stores of hay and feed. Harriet swore under her breath, a habit Thomas had always gently chided her for. She'd have to go out in this tempest and try to cover the hole before everything was ruined. As she prepared to step off the porch into the downpour, the enormity of her situation crashed over her. 5 years of stubborn independence, and what did she have to show for it? A failing farm, a body aching from work too heavy for one person, and a future that looked increasingly untenable. For the first time in 5 years, Harriet Chambers sat down on her porch steps and wept. Morning brought clear skies and the full extent of the storm's damage. The barn roof was worse than Harriet had feared. The hole had allowed water to soak nearly half her winter hay stores and a significant portion of the grain she had been saving for seed. The cost would be dear, both in money she didn't have and food her animals needed. As she assessed the damage, wiping sweat from her brow in the already warming day, the sound of hoofbeats again drew her attention. This time, 2 riders approached Wade Blackwood and a woman Harriet recognized as Mary Miller. "Morning, Harriet," Mary called as they drew near. Unlike Wade the day before, Mary didn't maintain a respectful distance but rode right up to the barn where Harriet stood. "Saw the damage to your roof from the road. Looks like that storm was rough on you." Harriet nodded stiffly, uncomfortably aware of her bedraggled appearance. She'd been up since dawn trying to salvage what she could from the barn. "Wade and I are checking on the outlying farms," Mary continued. "That storm took down trees all across the county." Harriet glanced at Wade, who sat quietly on his horse, his expression neutral. He didn't seem inclined to remind her of their conversation yesterday, or to point out that her current predicament perfectly illustrated his point about needing help. "I've got it handled," Harriet said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Mary dismounted, her practical riding skirt raising a small cloud of dust as she landed. "Harriet Chambers, I've known you since we were girls together in school. You're the most capable woman I've ever met, but even you can't fix a barn roof and salvage all this hay by yourself before the next rain comes." Harriet bristled. "I don't recall asking for your assessment, Mary." Mary was undeterred. "No, you never ask. That's the problem." She gestured to Wade. "Mr. Blackwood here is the best ranch hand I've ever seen. He fixed our north fence in half the time it would have taken Pa and me together." Wade finally spoke. "I'd be happy to help with your roof, Mrs. Chambers. No strings attached." Harriet looked between them, torn between her fierce independence and the practical reality of her situation. Pride was a luxury she was increasingly unable to afford. "I can pay a fair wage," she said finally. "For the roof repair only." Wade dismounted in one fluid motion. "No need for payment. Neighbors help neighbors out here." "We're not neighbors, Mr. Blackwood. You're a drifter who happens to be staying nearby." He didn't take offense at her blunt assessment. "Fair enough, but the offer stands." Mary intervened. "Harriet, let the man help. You'd do the same for any of us if positions were reversed." That was true, and Harriet knew it. With a sigh that felt like surrender, she nodded. "The roof, Mr. Blackwood, that's all." Wade smiled, a genuine expression that creased the corners of his eyes. "I'll ride back to the Miller place for tools and lumber. Be back before noon." Mary squeezed Harriet's arm. "I'd stay and help too, but I need to get back to Pa. His hip is paining him something fierce today." "Give him my regards," Harriet said, softening slightly. Jacob Miller had been a good friend to Thomas, and he'd always treated Harriet with respect, not pity. After Mary and Wade rode off, Harriet returned to the task of sorting through the wet hay. She worked methodically, separating what could be dried from what was already moldering. By the time Wade returned, she had cleared most of the debris from beneath the damaged roof section. Wade arrived with a wagon loaded with tools and lumber. He'd also brought food, a basket that obviously came from Mary's kitchen, filled with fresh bread, cheese, and jars of preserved vegetables. "Mary insisted," he said when Harriet frowned at the basket. "Said you'd be too busy to cook proper." Harriet couldn't argue with that logic, though it galled her to accept what felt like charity. "Thank you," she managed. Wade set to work immediately, assessing the damage with a professional eye. "Whole section needs to come down and be rebuilt," he said. "Those crossbeams are rotted through." Harriet's heart sank. That would be a much bigger job than she'd anticipated. "Just patch it enough to keep the rain out. I'll deal with a proper repair later." Wade shook his head. "A patch won't hold through another storm like last night's. Better to do it right once than have to do it twice." His logic was sound, but Harriet hated the implication that she'd been neglecting necessary repairs. "I've had other priorities," she said defensively. Wade's eyes met hers, and again she saw no judgment there. "Of course you have. Running a place this size alone means making hard choices about what gets fixed first." His understanding disarmed her. "The well pump broke last fall," she found herself explaining. "And then the chicken coop needed reinforcing after a mountain lion came through." Wade nodded. "One person can only do so much in a day." He climbed up to examine the roof more closely. "I'll need a hand with these beams. Would you mind?" And just like that, Harriet found herself working alongside Wade Blackwood, passing up tools and holding boards in place while he hammered and sawed. He was efficient and skilled, clearly experienced in building work. More surprisingly, he was easy to work with. He gave clear instructions without being condescending, and listened when she offered suggestions about the peculiarities of her barn's construction. By mid-afternoon, they had removed the damaged section entirely and begun framing the new roof. The day had grown hot, and Wade had removed his shirt, working in his undershirt that clung to his muscular frame with sweat. Harriet tried not to notice, but she was only human. It had been 5 years since she'd been in such close proximity to a man, let alone one with Wade's obvious physical attributes. "Water break," Wade announced, climbing down from the roof. He wiped his brow with a bandana and accepted the dipper of water Harriet offered from her well bucket. "You've made good progress," Harriet admitted, allowing herself a moment's rest in the shade of the barn. "We have," Wade corrected. "You're a good worker, Mrs. Chambers." "Harriet," she said impulsively, "if we're going to be working together, you might as well use my given name." A smile touched his lips. "Harriet, then, and I'm Wade." They ate a late lunch from Mary's basket, sitting on upturned buckets in the barn's shade. Wade asked questions about the farm, how many acres she had under cultivation, what livestock she kept, what crops she planned for the coming season. His questions were practical and respectful, showing genuine interest rather than doubting her capabilities. In turn, Harriet found herself curious about this man who had appeared so unexpectedly in her life. "Where are you from originally, Mr. Wade?" "All over, really. Born in Missouri, but my family moved to Colorado when I was young. Worked ranches from Wyoming to Texas since I was 16. "And what brings you to Montana?" Wade took a drink of water before answering. "Heard there was good land opening up here. Thought I might settle down eventually." Harriet raised an eyebrow. "A drifter looking to settle. Even drifters get tired of drifting eventually." His blue eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary, and Harriet felt a flutter in her stomach that she immediately suppressed. They returned to work, and by sundown, the new roof section was framed and partially boarded. It wouldn't keep out a heavy rain yet, but the forecast looked clear for the next few days. "I'll come back tomorrow to finish," Wade said as he packed his tools into the wagon. Harriet nodded, too tired to argue and secretly relieved. "I appreciate your help today." Wade looked at her for a long moment. "It's not weakness to accept help, Harriet. It's just practical." Before she could formulate a response, he had climbed into the wagon and driven away, leaving Harriet with a repaired barn and uncomfortably stirred emotions. The next morning, Harriet woke before dawn as usual, but found herself taking extra care with her appearance. She washed her face and hands, redid her hair more neatly than her usual functional bun, and even put on her slightly less worn work dress. She told herself it was simply a matter of professional respect, but a small voice in her mind mocked her pretense. Wade arrived as promised, bringing more lumber and, to Harriet's surprise, a crate of chickens. "Mary sent these," he explained. "Said her new Rhode Island Reds are laying more eggs than they can use." Harriet eyed the healthy-looking birds with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "That's very generous of Mary. She mentioned you lost some chickens to that fox last month, so Mary had been talking about her. Harriet wasn't sure how she felt about that. "Just 3, she said, "but they were good layers." They settled into work, and Harriet was again struck by how naturally they fell into a rhythm together. Wade didn't try to take over or direct her unnecessarily. He treated her as a capable partner, consulting on decisions and trusting her judgment. By midday, they had finished the roof completely. Wade had even reinforced some of the other beams that showed signs of wear, ensuring the barn would withstand many more seasons of Montana's harsh weather. As they stood back to admire their work, Wade turned to her. "I noticed your north field hasn't been plowed yet." Harriet stiffened. "I'll get to it. I'm sure you will, but plowing's hard work for one person, especially with a hand plow." "I manage." Wade regarded her steadily. "I've got no doubt of that. But I've also got time on my hands, and Jacob Miller's borrowed team of draft horses with nothing to do for the next few days." Harriet's practical side warred with her pride. The north field was her largest, and plowing it alone would take her at least a week of backbreaking labor. With horses and a proper plow, it could be done in 2 days. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Wade considered her question seriously. "When I first came to this territory, I was down on my luck. Horse had gone lame, I was low on supplies, and winter was coming on. An old trapper took me in, shared his cabin and his food, got me back on my feet." He shrugged. "Told me the only payment he wanted was for me to do the same for someone else someday. And I'm that someone." Harriet asked skeptically, "You're someone who could use a hand. That's enough." His simple answer disarmed her. There was no hidden agenda she could discern, no masculine pride or condescension, just one human being offering help to another. "The north field needs to be planted with wheat by the end of the month," she said finally. Wade smiled. "I'll bring the team tomorrow." True to his word, Wade arrived the next morning leading 2 powerful draft horses and a proper steel plow. Harriet had only ever used a hand plow, and she watched with barely concealed amazement as Wade and the horses cut through the earth with ease, turning neat furrows that would have taken her days of labor. "Want to try?" Wade asked after the first few rows, offering her the reins. Harriet hesitated only briefly before accepting. Wade showed her how to guide the horses and manage the plow, his hands briefly covering hers on the reins. The contact was fleeting but sent a jolt of awareness through her that she hadn't felt in years. Controlling the powerful horses was exhilarating. Harriet found herself smiling genuinely for what felt like the first time in ages as the rich soil turned beneath the plow blade. "You're a natural," Wade called, walking alongside to ensure she had control of the team. They took turns throughout the day, making tremendous progress. By sunset, nearly half the field was plowed, work that would have taken Harriet at least 4 days on her own. As they cared for the horses afterward, rubbing them down and feeding them, Harriet found herself relaxing in Wade's company. His quiet competence and lack of pretension made him easy to be around. When he commented on her skilled handling of the horses, she found herself sharing stories of growing up on her father's farm in Iowa, where she'd learned to ride almost before she could walk. "How did you end up in Montana?" Wade asked as they walked back to the cabin in the gathering dusk. "Thomas, my husband, had a dream of homesteading, building something that would be ours alone." Harriet's voice softened at the memory. "We came out in '73, just after we married." He'd read about the Homestead Act and couldn't stop talking about the opportunity. "It's good land," Wade observed. "He chose well." "Yes," Harriet agreed. "Though sometimes I wonder if we knew what we were getting into. Those first years were challenging. Homesteading always is. Takes grit to make it work." "Thomas had grit in spades," Harriet said, a note of pride in her voice. "Worked from sunrise to sunset. We both did." "And after he passed, you kept it going alone," Wade said, his voice warm with admiration. "That takes even more grit." They had reached the cabin, and Harriet paused at the steps. The twilight cast long shadows across the yard, and in the dim light, Wade's features were softened, his eyes reflecting the last golden rays of the setting sun. "Would you like to stay for supper?" Harriet asked impulsively. "It's plain fare, but there's plenty." Wade seemed surprised but pleased by the invitation. "I'd be honored." Inside the cabin, Harriet busied herself with preparing a meal of salt pork, beans, and the last of her winter preserves. Wade insisted on helping, slicing bread and setting the table with a domestic ease that suggested he was no stranger to household tasks. As they ate by lamplight, the conversation flowed more easily than Harriet would have expected. Wade told stories of his travels, cattle drives in Texas, mining camps in Colorado, fishing villages in Oregon. He had a gift for description that made Harriet feel as if she were seeing these faraway places herself. In return, she found herself sharing memories of Thomas and their early years on the homestead. She hadn't spoken of Thomas so freely to anyone since his death, but Wade listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was truly engaged. "He sounds like he was a good man," Wade said when she described Thomas's persistent optimism even during their hardest times. "The best," Harriet agreed. "Stubborn as a mule but kind-hearted. Everyone in the county respected him." "And they respect you too," Wade observed. "Mary Miller speaks very highly of you," Harriet shrugged. "Mary's generous that way. It's not just generosity. She told me there's not a harder working or more honorable person in the territory than Harriet Chambers." Harriet felt her cheeks warm at the praise. "Mary exaggerates." "I don't think she does," Wade said quietly, his blue eyes meeting hers across the table. "I've only known you a few days, but I can already see she's right." The moment stretched between them, filled with something Harriet wasn't ready to name. She stood abruptly, clearing the plates. "It's getting late. You should probably head back to the Miller place before it's fully dark." If Wade was disappointed by her sudden withdrawal, he didn't show it. He helped her clear the table, then collected his hat. "I'll be back tomorrow with the horses if that suits you." Harriet nodded, not trusting herself to speak. At the door, Wade paused. "Thank you for supper, Harriet, and for the conversation. It's been a long time since I enjoyed an evening so much." After he left, Harriet stood at the window watching his figure recede down the road until darkness swallowed him completely. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge the flutter of anticipation she felt at the thought of seeing him again tomorrow. Over the next week, Wade returned daily. Together they finished plowing the north field and began on the smaller east field. They repaired fences, reinforced the chicken coop, and even found time to fix the leaking roof on Harriet's cabin. Tasks that had seemed overwhelming when faced alone became manageable, even enjoyable, when shared. Each evening, Wade stayed for supper, and their conversations grew deeper. Harriet learned about his family parents lost to influenza when he was 18, a younger sister married to a shopkeeper in Denver whom he visited when he could. She told him about her own past her education at a women's seminary in Iowa, her brief stint as a schoolteacher before marrying Thomas, her dreams of someday expanding the farm to include an orchard. On the seventh day, as they finished the east field plowing, a wagon approached from the direction of town. Harriet recognized the driver as Bill Jenkins, the banker's son who had made no secret of his interest in her land over the years. "Harriet," Bill called as he pulled his wagon to a stop. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Wade. "I see you've hired help." "Mr. Blackwood is assisting me, yes," Harriet said coolly. She had never liked Bill's presumptuous manner. Bill climbed down from his wagon, his gaze moving assessingly over the freshly plowed fields and repaired buildings. "Place is looking better. I came to see if you'd reconsidered my offer." Harriet stiffened. Bill had approached her multiple times over the years with insultingly low offers to buy her land. "My answer hasn't changed, Bill. The farm isn't for sale." Bill's expression hardened. "You're being stubborn, Harriet. A woman alone can't make this place profitable long-term. You know that." Wade stepped forward, his posture relaxed but somehow conveying that he wasn't a man to be trifled with. "Mrs. Chambers seems to be managing just fine." Bill eyed Wade with open dislike. "And you are, Wade Blackwood, friend of the Millers and Mrs. Chambers." "Well, Mr. Blackwood, this is a private business matter between myself and the widow Chambers." "Former teacher and current landowner Harriet Chambers," Harriet corrected, irritated by his dismissive tone. And as I've told you before, Bill, this land isn't for sale at any price. It was Thomas's dream, and I intend to keep it." Bill's face flushed with anger. "Sentiment won't feed you when crops fail or pay taxes when they come due. You're being foolish, and everyone in town knows it. It's just a matter of time before you're forced to sell, and my offer won't be as generous then." Wade took another step forward, his voice still pleasant but with an edge of steel beneath. "I believe the lady has made her position clear, Mr. Jenkins. Perhaps it's time you headed back to town." For a moment, it seemed Bill might argue further, but something in Wade's steady gaze made him reconsider. With a curt nod to Harriet, he climbed back into his wagon. "Think about it, Harriet. My offer stands until the end of the month." After he'd gone, Harriet's hands trembled with suppressed anger. "The nerve of that man. Thinks because I'm a woman alone I'll eventually give in." Wade watched her with quiet admiration. "You handled him well. He's been circling like a vulture since Thomas died. His father owns the bank that holds the mortgage on this place. They've been hoping I'll fail." Harriet's voice held fierce determination. "I won't give them the satisfaction." "No," Wade agreed. "I don't imagine you will." That evening, as they sat on Harriet's porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, a comfortable silence fell between them. The day's confrontation with Bill had stirred up old anxieties for Harriet, but Wade's steady presence beside her was oddly calming. "Thank you," she said finally, "for what you said to Bill today." Wade shrugged. "I only stated the obvious. You are managing fine." "Am I?" Harriet's voice held a rare note of vulnerability. "Sometimes I wonder if he's right, if I'm just postponing the inevitable." Wade turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Harriet, in the week I've been here, I've seen more capability and determination in you than in most men I've worked with over the years. This land is thriving because of your care." "It's thriving better with help," she admitted quietly. "I've accomplished more in this past week than in the previous month." "That's not surprising. Farming was never meant to be a solitary occupation. Even the most independent homesteaders relied on neighbors for barn raisings and harvest help." Harriet knew he was right. Before Thomas died, they had participated in the community's rhythm of mutual aid, helping with neighbors' harvests, joining in barn raisings, sharing equipment and expertise. It was only after his death that she had withdrawn, determined to prove she could manage alone. "I've been so focused on not appearing weak," she confessed, "that I forgot what Thomas always said, that our strength was in how we worked together. Not just him and me, but all of us out here trying to build something in this wilderness." Wade nodded. "There's no weakness in interdependence, Harriet. It's how communities survive." His words resonated with something deep inside her, a truth she had known but forgotten in her determination to stand alone. She turned to face him fully, seeing him in the fading light as if for the first time. The strong line of his jaw, the kindness in his eyes, the quiet confidence he carried. "Wade," she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say, only that something had shifted between them. But the moment was interrupted by the distant sound of riders approaching. They both stood, peering into the gathering darkness. 3 men on horseback were coming up the road at a fast pace. Wade's posture changed instantly, tension evident in his shoulders. "Get inside, Harriet." "What? Why?" "Those riders are coming too fast for a social call, and it's almost dark." "Please, go inside and get your rifle." Something in his tone made her obey without further question. Harriet hurried into the cabin and retrieved her rifle from its place by the door. Through the window, she could see Wade standing calmly on the porch, his hand resting near the pistol holstered at his hip. The riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. In the dim light, Harriet recognized one as Mike Leary, a local troublemaker who had worked briefly for Thomas years ago before being dismissed for stealing. The other two were strangers to her. "Well, look what we have here," Leary called. The drifters made himself at home with the widow Chambers. Wade didn't move. "Evening, gentlemen. Something I can help you with." Leary dismounted, his movements slightly unsteady. Harriet could tell even from inside that he'd been drinking. "Heard in town you've been getting mighty cozy with the widow. Jenkins was saying how you ran him off today." Mr. Jenkins was mistaken about Mrs. Chambers's intentions regarding her property. "I merely helped clarify the situation." Leary laughed, an ugly sound. "Always knew Harriet Chambers was too high and mighty for local boys. Guess she was just waiting for the right drifter to come along." Harriet had heard enough. She stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. "That's close enough, Mike Leary. You and your friends can turn around and leave the way you came." Leary's expression darkened. "Now don't be like that, Harriet. We just came to have a friendly talk with your new farmhand." "There's nothing friendly about 3 armed men riding up to my property after dark." Harriet's voice was steady, though her heart pounded. "I want you to leave. Now." The other 2 men exchanged glances, clearly not having expected armed resistance. Leary, however, was too drunk or too stupid to back down. "You always were too good for the rest of us," he sneered. "Thomas Chambers barely cold in his grave, and here you are taking up with the first stranger who wanders through." Wade's voice cut through the tension. "I suggest you apologize to the lady and be on your way, Mr. Leary. You're embarrassing yourself." Leary's hand moved toward his gun, but Wade was faster. In one fluid motion, he had his pistol drawn and aimed. "I wouldn't," Wade said quietly. "I've got no desire to shoot you, but I will if you force the issue." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then one of Leary's companions leaned over and grabbed his arm. "Come on, Mike. This ain't worth getting shot over." Leary hesitated, then slowly moved his hand away from his weapon. "This ain't over," he muttered. "I think it is," Wade replied evenly. "Mrs. Chambers has made it clear you're not welcome here. I suggest you respect her wishes." The 3 men finally turned their horses and rode off, Leary casting one last venomous glance over his shoulder. When they were out of sight, Harriet realized she was shaking. Wade holstered his pistol and turned to her with concern. "Are you all right?" She nodded, trying to steady her breathing. "Yes, I'm just not used to confrontations like that. You handled yourself well. Not many would stand their ground against 3 armed men." Harriet managed a weak smile. "Not my first encounter with Mike Leary. He's all bluster when sober but mean when drinking." Wade frowned. "Has he threatened you before?" "Not directly. But he's ridden by a few times, shouting insults." Harriet shrugged, trying to appear more nonchalant than she felt. "It's nothing I can't handle." Wade studied her face for a long moment. "You shouldn't have to handle it alone." The simple statement hit Harriet with unexpected force. She had been handling everything alone for so long that she'd almost forgotten there was any other way to live. "It's getting late," she said, suddenly needing time to process her tumultuous emotions. "You should probably head back to the miller's before it gets any darker." Wade hesitated. "After what just happened, I'm not comfortable leaving you alone. Leary might come back once he's had more to drink." Harriet wanted to insist she would be fine, that she had managed alone for 5 years and could certainly handle one night. But the truth was, Leary's appearance had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. "There's the old bunkhouse," she said finally. "Thomas built it when we thought we might hire hands eventually. It's basic but sound. You could stay there tonight if you're concerned." Relief showed in Wade's eyes. "Thank you. I'd feel better knowing I was close by if there's trouble." They walked together to the small structure behind the barn. Harriet hadn't entered it in years, but she kept it maintained with the rest of the outbuildings. Inside were 4 simple bunks, a table, and a small stove. Everything was dusty but intact. "I'll get you some bedding," Harriet said, suddenly awkward at the thought of Wade sleeping so close to her home. "Don't worry about it," Wade assured her. "I've got my bedroll in my saddlebags. I've slept in far worse places than this." Harriet nodded, lingering in the doorway. "Thank you," she said softly, "for staying." Wade's smile was gentle. "Get some rest, Harriet. I'll be right here if you need me." That night, Harriet lay awake long after she had blown out her lamp. The events of the day replayed in her mind: Bill Jenkins's unwelcome visit, Wade's steady support, the confrontation with Leary and his friends. But most of all, she thought about Wade himself. In just 1 week, he had become a presence in her life that she couldn't have imagined before. His quiet strength, his respect for her independence while still offering genuine help, the way he looked at her as if truly seeing her not as a widow to be pitied or land to be acquired, but as a woman of value. It was that last thought that kept Harriet awake into the small hours. Because beneath her practical exterior, she was still a woman with a woman's needs and desires. And those had been buried so deeply after Thomas died that she had almost forgotten their existence. Now, with Wade sleeping just a short distance away in the bunkhouse, those feelings were awakening. And that terrified her more than any threat Mike Leary could pose. Morning came with a soft spring rain, the gentle patter on the roof waking Harriet from her fitful sleep. She dressed quickly and went to the kitchen to start breakfast, only to find Wade already there, coffee brewing on the stove. "Hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to the pot. "Saw your light was still out and thought you might appreciate coffee ready when you woke." Harriet was struck by the domestic scene, this tall, capable man moving comfortably in her kitchen, his hair slightly damp from the rain outside. "Thank you," she managed. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough. No sign of Leary or his friends." Harriet busied herself with cooking breakfast flapjacks and the last of her smoked bacon. They ate together at her small table, rain drumming steadily on the roof. The forced intimacy of being kept indoors by the weather created a different kind of tension between them. "What are your plans, Wade?" Harriet asked suddenly. "You mentioned wanting to settle eventually. Do you mean to stay in this area?" Wade considered her question as he sipped his coffee. "I've grown fond of this part of Montana. The people are good, the land is rich. Yes, I think I could put down roots here, on your own land. That's the dream. Find the right piece of ground, build something lasting." His eyes met hers across the table. "What about you, Harriet? Do you plan to stay here indefinitely?" "This is my home," she said simply. "Thomas and I built it together. His dreams are in every board and beam." Wade nodded thoughtfully. "Dreams can change, though, or expand to include new ones." The implication hung in the air between them. Harriet felt a flutter of panic and stood to clear the dishes. "The rain seems to be letting up. We should be able to get back to work soon." Wade didn't press the issue, but as he helped her with the dishes, his hand brushed against hers. The brief contact sent a jolt through Harriet that she couldn't ignore. For the rest of the day, they worked in the barn, taking advantage of the rain to sort through Harriet's tools and supplies. The close quarters and shared tasks kept them in constant proximity, and Harriet found herself increasingly aware of Wade's every movement, the flex of his muscles as he lifted heavy equipment, the careful precision of his hands as he repaired broken tools, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled at something she said. By evening, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a freshly washed world glistening in the sunset's glow. They stood together on the porch, watching the clouds turn pink and gold above the mountains. "Beautiful country," Wade said softly. "Yes," Harriet agreed. "I never tire of this view." It's different every day, but always magnificent. Wade turned to look at her, his expression serious. Harriet, there's something I need to tell you. Her heart skipped a beat at his tone. What is it? Jacob Miller's place is just about set for the season. He won't be needing my help much longer. Oh, Harriet tried to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. Will you be moving on then? Wade hesitated. That depends. On what? On you. His blue eyes held hers steadily. I've come to care for you, Harriet. More than I expected to when I first rode up to your farm. Harriet felt her breath catch. Part of her had known this was coming, had perhaps even hoped for it, but hearing the words spoken aloud made them real in a way she wasn't prepared for. Wade, you don't need to say anything now, he interrupted gently. I know this is sudden. I know you've been on your own a long time and that Thomas's memory is still important to you. I respect that. He took a deep breath. I'm just asking if there might be room in your life for something new. For someone new. Harriet turned away, emotions warring within her. Part of her yearned to say yes immediately, to admit that in the short time she'd known him, Wade had awakened feelings she thought long buried. But another part, the part that had survived these 5 years through fierce independence, was terrified of the vulnerability that came with opening her heart again. I need time, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Wade nodded, disappointment evident in his eyes but acceptance too. I understand. I'll head back to the Millers tonight, give you some space to think. As he saddled his horse, Harriet stood by the barn door, arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. When Wade was ready to leave, he approached her one last time. Whatever you decide, Harriet, know that these days working beside you have been the best I've had in a very long time. After he rode away, Harriet returned to her empty cabin. It seemed colder and quieter than before, as if Wade's presence had filled spaces she hadn't realized were vacant. She moved to the small trunk at the foot of her bed and opened it, taking out the daguerreotype of Thomas that she kept wrapped in soft cloth. His kind face looked back at her, frozen in time at 30 years old, the age he'd been when the traveling photographer had passed through their settlement. She had loved him deeply, had built her life around their shared dreams. What would you think, Thomas? She whispered to the image. Would you want me to spend the rest of my days alone, protecting what we built? Or would you want me to find happiness again? Of course, the photograph couldn't answer. But as Harriet sat in the quiet of her cabin, memories of Thomas flooded back, not just of his death and the pain of losing him, but of his life and the joy they had shared. Thomas had been a man who embraced life fully, who believed in taking chances for the possibility of happiness. Live well, Harriet, he had told her in his final days, his voice weak but his eyes intense. Don't let our dream become your prison. At the time, she had been too grief-stricken to fully understand his meaning. Now, 5 years later, with the prospect of a new beginning before her, his words returned with startling clarity. Harriet slept fitfully that night, her dreams a confused jumble of past and present Thomas and Wade, the farm as it had been and as it could be, her life alone and the possibility of a shared future. Morning brought no easy answers, but it did bring the routine of chores that had sustained Harriet through her darkest days. As she fed the chickens and milked her cow, she tried to imagine what her life might look like with Wade in it. Would they live here on her land? Would they combine their dreams, as she had once done with Thomas? The sound of an approaching wagon interrupted her thoughts. Expecting to see Wade, Harriet felt a mixture of disappointment and concern when she recognized Bill Jenkins driving with his father, the banker, beside him. "Morning, Harriet," the elder Jenkins called as they pulled up in front of her cabin. Unlike his son, Harold Jenkins maintained a veneer of politeness, though Harriet knew his intentions were no less predatory. "Mr. Jenkins," she acknowledged coolly. "This is an unexpected visit." Harold climbed down from the wagon with the stiff movements of an aging man who spent most of his days behind a desk. "Thought we should have a talk about your situation, Harriet." "My situation is fine, thank you," Bill snorted. "That's not what I saw yesterday. You've got undesirables hanging around, threatening respectable businessmen." Harriet raised an eyebrow. "If you're referring to Mr. Blackwood, he was helping me with spring planting, and the only threatening behavior I witnessed yesterday was from your son." Harold waved a dismissive hand. "Let's not get sidetracked. I've come about your mortgage payment." A chill ran through Harriet. "The payment isn't due for another 2 weeks. I'll have it then, as always." "Yes, well, there's been a change." Harold extracted a document from his coat pocket. "The bank's board has decided to call in certain loans that represent higher risk. Your mortgage, unfortunately, falls into that category." Harriet's hands clenched at her sides. "My payments have never been late." "True," Harold conceded, "but a single woman running a homestead this size. The board feels the risk of default is too high. We're requiring full payment within 30 days. Harriet felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. The remaining mortgage was more money than she could possibly raise in a month. "You can't do that." "The terms of the loan are quite clear," Harold interrupted, pointing to a clause in the document. "The bank reserves the right to call in the loan at any time if circumstances suggest increased risk." Bill smirked. "Of course, we'd be willing to buy the property from you. Save you the trouble of finding another buyer on short notice." Harriet fought to keep her voice steady. "This is because of yesterday, isn't it? Because your son didn't get his way." Harold's expression hardened. "This is business, Harriet, nothing personal." "I'll fight this," she said, anger replacing her initial shock. "This is my home, and I won't let you steal it through underhanded tactics." "Fight all you want," Bill said smugly, "but unless you can come up with the full amount in 30 days, this land will be auctioned to the highest bidder. And in this county, that's likely to be us." After they left, Harriet stood in her yard, the document clutched in her trembling hands. The weight of what had just happened threatened to overwhelm her. 5 years of backbreaking work, of holding on through blizzards and droughts, predators and loneliness, all of it might amount to nothing in the face of the Jenkinses' greed. She needed to think, to find a solution. But first, she needed advice from someone who understood the law better than she did. Saddling her mare, Harriet rode toward town with a determination born of desperation. The local lawyer, James Morgan, had been a friend of Thomas's. If anyone could help her fight the Jenkinses' scheme, it would be him. The ride to town gave Harriet time to process her thoughts. The beautiful spring day seemed to mock her troubles, with wildflowers blooming alongside the trail and birds singing in the cottonwoods along the creek. She barely noticed, her mind racing through possible solutions to her predicament. Morgan's office was on the main street of the small town, a modest building wedged between the general store and the barber shop. Harriet tied her horse to the hitching post and straightened her skirts before entering. James Morgan looked up from his desk, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Harriet Chambers, this is an unexpected pleasure." "I wish it were a pleasure, James," Harriet said grimly, extending the document Harold Jenkins had given her. "I need your help." Morgan read through the paper, his frown deepening with each paragraph. "This is unconscionable," he muttered finally. "But unfortunately, not illegal. The clause is indeed in the original mortgage agreement, though I doubt Thomas ever imagined it would be invoked in this manner." "So there's nothing I can do?" Harriet asked, her heart sinking. Morgan sighed. "I can file a petition for more time, argue that the bank's determination of increased risk is arbitrary and capricious. It might buy you a few more weeks, but ultimately—" He shook his head. Unless you can raise the money, the bank has the legal right to foreclose. How am I supposed to raise that much money in a month? Or even 2 months? Harriet's voice cracked with the strain of maintaining her composure. You have any family who might help? Or perhaps consider taking on a partner in the farm? Harriet's thoughts immediately went to Wade. Would he consider such an arrangement? But the idea of approaching him for financial help, especially after his declaration of feelings for her, seemed impossible. She couldn't bear the thought of him thinking she had turned to him out of necessity rather than genuine affection. "I'll figure something out," she said, standing to leave. "Thank you for your time, James." "Harriet," Morgan called as she reached the door. "For what it's worth, I think what the Jenkins are doing is despicable. If there's anything else I can do to help, please let me know." Harriet nodded her thanks and stepped back into the sunshine. Her next stop was the general store, where she needed to purchase seeds for the kitchen garden. As she entered, several conversations halted abruptly, and she felt the weight of curious stares. News traveled fast in small towns, and clearly word of Wade's presence at her farm had made the rounds. Mary Miller approached her immediately, her friendly face a welcome sight amid the barely concealed nosiness of the other customers. "Harriet, I was hoping to see you in town today." Harriet managed a small smile for her friend. "Hello, Mary. How is your father doing?" "Much better, thanks to Mr. Blackwood's help." Mary drew Harriet to a quiet corner of the store. "Speaking of whom, he returned late last night looking rather forlorn. Might that have anything to do with you?" Harriet sighed. Of course Mary would notice. "It's complicated, Mary." Mary's expression softened with understanding. "Matters of the heart usually are. But if it helps, I've never seen a more honorable man than Wade Blackwood. Pa says he's the hardest worker he's ever met and the gentlest with the animals." "I know," Harriet said quietly. "That's not the issue." "Then what is? If you don't mind my asking." Harriet hesitated, then decided to confide in her friend. She explained about Wade's declaration and her own conflicted feelings, though she held back the news about the bank's actions. That humiliation was still too fresh. Mary listened without interruption, her eyes sympathetic. When Harriet finished, she took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Harriet, no one who knew Thomas would ever think you disloyal for finding happiness again, least of all Thomas himself." "It's not just that," Harriet admitted. I've been alone so long, made my own decisions, answered to no one. The thought of sharing my life again, of being vulnerable, is terrifying," Mary finished for her. "Of course it is. But might it also be wonderful?" Before Harriet could respond, the store's bell jangled as new customers entered. Wade and Jacob Miller came in, deep in conversation. They both stopped short at the sight of Harriet. "Harriet," Wade said, his voice carefully neutral though his eyes conveyed a wealth of emotion. "Wade," she replied, suddenly conscious of the many ears listening to their exchange. An awkward silence fell until Jacob Miller broke it with a hearty clap on Wade's shoulder. "Well, don't just stand there like a fence post, son. I believe you and Mrs. Chambers have matters to discuss." Mary took her father's arm. "Indeed you do. Pa and I will just finish our shopping while you two talk." Before Harriet could protest, the Millers had moved to the far side of the store, leaving her alone with Wade in the corner. He removed his hat, his blue eyes searching her face. "I didn't expect to see you in town today," he said. "I had business with Mr. Morgan," Harriet replied, not ready to explain the full situation. Wade nodded, respecting her privacy. "Harriet, about last night I've been thinking about what you said," she interrupted. "About there being room in my life for someone new." Hope flickered in his eyes. And I'm terrified," she admitted, the honest words tumbling out before she could reconsider. "Terrified of feeling again, of depending on someone, of losing someone again. But also, she took a deep breath, terrified of letting this chance pass by. Wade stepped closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I would never ask you to give up your independence, Harriet. That spirit, that strength is part of what draws me to you. I don't want to replace Thomas or erase what you built together. I just want the chance to build something new together." His words touched Harriet deeply, addressing fears she had barely acknowledged to herself. Before she could respond, however, the store's door opened again and Bill Jenkins entered. His face darkened when he saw Harriet and Wade together. "Well, isn't this cozy?" he sneered. "Didn't take you long to find a replacement provider, did it, Harriet?" The store fell silent, all pretense of not eavesdropping abandoned. Harriet felt heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment but from anger. "That's enough, Bill," she said firmly. "Your business with me is concluded for today." Bill's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I think our business is just beginning. Has she told you, Blackwood, that she's about to lose that precious farm of hers, that in 30 days it'll belong to me and my father?" Wade's expression remained impassive, though Harriet could see the tension in his jaw. "Mrs. Chambers's affairs are her own business. They're about to be everybody's business," Bill retorted. "When a woman can't pay her debts and has to rely on drifters to help her keep her farm running, that's news in a small town." Harriet felt the stares of everyone in the store, some sympathetic, others curious, a few judgmental. The humiliation Bill intended was achieving its purpose, but beneath her embarrassment, a deeper anger was building. For 5 years, she had fought to maintain her dignity and independence in the face of doubters like Bill Jenkins. She would not be cowed now. "Is that what you think, Bill?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "That I need a man to save me? That I've been looking for a replacement provider, as you so crudely put it?" Bill smirked. "The evidence speaks for itself." "The evidence," Harriet said, raising her voice so everyone in the store could hear, "is that I have run my farm successfully for 5 years since Thomas died. I have never missed a mortgage payment. I have never asked for charity. What I have done is finally accept that neighbors helping neighbors is not weakness but the way communities thrive." She gestured to Wade. "Mr. Blackwood offered his assistance, which I accepted just as I would have offered mine to anyone in need." Mary Miller stepped forward. "That's right. And my father accepted Wade's help too. Does that make him weak, Bill Jenkins?" Old Jacob Miller snorted. "I'd like to see you suggest it to my face, boy." Several of the townspeople chuckled, and Bill's confident expression faltered. Wade stood silently beside Harriet, his presence supportive but not intrusive. He was letting her fight her own battle, she realized, while making it clear he stood with her. "The bank's decision stands," Bill said finally, though with less conviction. 30 days, Harriet. Then we'll see how independent you really are." After he stormed out, a murmur of conversation swept through the store. Mary approached Harriet immediately. "What was that about the bank?" Harriet explained the situation briefly, aware that her words would be repeated throughout town by nightfall. To her surprise, the reaction from those listening was largely sympathetic. "That's not right," the blacksmith's wife declared. "The Jenkins have been trying to get their hands on the Chambers place for years. Heard they want to sell it to that mining company from Helena," another customer added. "The one that's been buying up land all over the county." Wade turned to Harriet, his expression concerned. "Is this true, about the mortgage being called in?" Harriet nodded, embarrassed that he had learned of her predicament in such a public manner. "I was going to tell you privately." "Let's step outside," he suggested quietly. Once on the boardwalk, away from curious ears, Wade turned to Harriet. "Tell me everything." She explained about the bank's demands and her meeting with Morgan. "There's no legal recourse," she concluded. "Unless I can raise the money in 30 days, I'll lose the farm." Wade's expression was thoughtful rather than pitying. "How much is needed?" Harriet told him, the sum sounding even more impossible when spoken aloud. "I have some savings," Wade said immediately. "Not nearly enough for the full amount, but it would be a start." "No," Harriet shook her head firmly. "I appreciate the offer, Wade, truly I do, but I can't accept your money." "Why not? If we were to—" He stopped, recalibrating. "Even as a loan, then?" "With interest, if that makes it easier for you to accept." Harriet was touched by his offer, but her pride and sense of independence ran deep. "It's not about the terms, Wade. It's about facing this challenge on my own terms." Wade studied her face, understanding dawning in his eyes. "This isn't just about the farm for you, is it? It's about proving something to yourself, to the town, to Thomas's memory." His insight struck her to the core. "Yes," she admitted softly. "For 5 years, I've defined myself by my ability to keep Thomas's dream alive, to succeed where everyone expected me to fail. If I lose the farm now—" "You'll still be Harriet Chambers," Wade said firmly. "Still the strongest, most determined woman I've ever met. The farm is what you do, not who you are." His words resonated with Harriet in a way she hadn't expected. She had so thoroughly intertwined her identity with the homestead that the prospect of losing it felt like losing herself. But Wade was right, she was more than the land she worked. Thomas had seen that in her from the beginning, had loved her for her spirit and determination, not just for her willingness to share his dream. "I need to think," she said finally, "about the farm and about us. There's so much happening at once." Wade nodded, respecting her need for space. "I understand. But Harriet, whatever you decide about us, please know that my offer of help with the bank situation stands. Not because I think you can't handle it yourself, but because I care about what happens to you." Harriet felt a surge of gratitude for this man who seemed to understand her so well after such a short time. "Thank you, Wade." As she rode home that afternoon, Harriet's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The Jenkinses' scheme, Wade's declaration of feelings, the town's unexpected support, all of it combined to leave her emotionally exhausted. Yet beneath the turmoil, a strange clarity was emerging. For 5 years, she had viewed her independence as her greatest strength. Now she was beginning to see that true strength might lie in knowing when to stand alone and when to accept connection. The farm came into view as she crested the hill, the cabin she and Thomas had built together, the fields they had cleared side by side, the barn where they had spent countless hours working and dreaming. It was home, every inch of it saturated with memories and hard-won achievements. But as Harriet dismounted and led her mare to the barn, she realized something profound. The farm wasn't Thomas's dream anymore. It was hers, and what she wanted for her future was not merely to preserve the past, but to build something new. That night, Harriet sat at her table with paper and pencil, working through her options methodically. She could try to borrow from neighbors, though few had money to spare. She could sell livestock and equipment, though that would make running the farm nearly impossible if she did manage to keep it. She could look for a buyer other than the Jenkins, though that would mean giving up the land entirely. None of these options satisfied her. As she stared at the numbers, frustration mounting, a new idea began to take shape. It was unconventional, perhaps even scandalous by small-town standards. But it might just work. The next morning, Harriet rode to the Miller farm. Mary welcomed her warmly, and after exchanging pleasantries, Harriet asked to speak with Wade privately. They walked together to the edge of the Miller property, where a small creek provided both privacy and a pleasant backdrop for conversation. Wade waited patiently for Harriet to speak, his expression open but careful. "I've been thinking about what you said," Harriet began. "About building something new together." Hope flickered in Wade's eyes, but he remained measured in his response. And I think I'd like to try," she said, the words both terrifying and liberating, not because of the bank situation, but in spite of it. "These past weeks with you have shown me possibilities I thought were closed to me forever." Wade's face broke into a smile that transformed his features. "Harriet, I can't tell you what that means to me. But," she continued, raising a hand, "I need to be clear about something. I'm still determined to fight for my farm, on my own terms." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Wade assured her. "Your independence is part of who you are. I would never want to change that." Harriet took a deep breath. "I have a proposition for you." "A business proposition," she clarified, "separate from our personal feelings." Wade's expression turned curious. "I'm listening. You said you want to settle in this area to find land of your own. What if you became my partner in the farm, legally as a business arrangement? You would invest your savings as a part owner, giving us enough capital to make a substantial payment to the bank and negotiate better terms for the remainder." Wade considered her proposal thoughtfully. "And in return, I'd own a share of the farm." "Yes. We would run it together, make decisions together, share the profits and the work." Harriet met his gaze directly. "It would be a partnership in every sense. And us, our personal relationship, that would be separate," Harriet said firmly. "I want to explore what's between us, Wade. But I don't want either of us to feel trapped by financial entanglement if things don't work out between us personally." Wade nodded slowly, understanding the distinction she was making. A business partnership with clear terms, and a personal relationship allowed to develop naturally, without pressure. Exactly. Harriet felt a weight lifting as he grasped her intent. "It would give us the best chance at both saving the farm and building something meaningful together." "It's unconventional," Wade admitted with a small smile. "But then, you've never been one for convention, have you, Harriet Chambers?" Harriet laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "No, I suppose not." Wade took her hands in his expression turning serious. "I accept your proposition, Harriet, both the business arrangement and the invitation to see where our feelings lead us." The relief and joy that flooded Harriet was almost overwhelming. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly hopeful about the future, not just surviving, but potentially thriving. "There's one more thing," she said. "If we do this, there will be talk. The town already has plenty to gossip about with you helping at my farm. A formal business partnership between us will fuel speculation." Wade's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Does that bother you?" Harriet considered the question honestly. "It would have, once. Now I find I care more about what we're building than what others think of it." "That's good," Wade said softly. "Because while I respect the boundaries you've set between our business arrangement and our personal feelings, I should warn you I intend to court you properly, Harriet Chambers, and I make no promises to be subtle about it." The warmth in his blue eyes sent a thrill through Harriet that had nothing to do with business partnerships and everything to do with the awakening of long dormant emotions. "I would expect nothing less, Mr. Blackwood." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Wade moved his belongings to Harriet's bunkhouse, and together they drafted a formal partnership agreement with James Morgan's help. The lawyer was surprised by their arrangement but supportive, especially when he understood it as a strategy to counter the Jenkinses' scheme. With their combined resources, they were able to make a substantial payment to the bank, enough to justify Morgan's legal argument that the loan was not at risk. Harold Jenkins was furious, but could find no legal grounds to refuse the payment or continue with the foreclosure. Word of Harriet and Wade's business partnership spread quickly through the community. As expected, there was gossip, but to Harriet's surprise, much of the reaction was positive. Many in town had resented the Jenkinses' manipulative business practices for years, and were pleased to see someone stand up to them successfully. On the farm, Wade proved himself to be everything Harriet had hoped for in a partner. He worked tirelessly alongside her, bringing new ideas while respecting her experience and knowledge of the land. Together, they finished the spring planting in record time and began improvements that Harriet had long envisioned, but never had the manpower to implement. True to his word, Wade also began courting Harriet with a gentle persistence that both honored her need for independence and made his growing feelings clear. He brought her wildflowers gathered from the hillsides, carved wooden animals for her collection during evening rest times, and often prepared supper for them both after long days of work. For Harriet, the experience of being courted at 32 was both sweet and strange. With Thomas, their courtship had been brief and youthful, full of grand dreams and little practical knowledge of what lay ahead. With Wade, there was a maturity and depth that came from two people who had known hardship and loss, who understood the value of what they were building together. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Wade turned to Harriet with an unusually serious expression. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said. Harriet's heart quickened. Though their partnership had been progressing well, both professionally and personally, they had maintained the separation she had initially requested. Wade still slept in the bunkhouse, and while they had shared increasingly tender moments, he had respected her pace in deepening their relationship. "What is it?" she asked. Wade reached into his pocket and extracted a small object, holding it in his closed hand. "I've been carrying this for almost 2 weeks now, waiting for the right moment." He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold ring with a small sapphire. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The only thing of value I've kept through all my years of traveling." Harriet's breath caught as she realized what was happening. "Wade, I'm not asking for an answer today," he said quickly. "I know we agreed to let things develop naturally between us. But I want you to know that my feelings have only grown stronger with each day. I love you, Harriet Chambers. I love your strength and your determination, your kindness and your fierce independence. I love working beside you and building something meaningful together." Tears welled in Harriet's eyes as Wade continued. "When you're ready, whether that's a month from now or a year, I want to make our partnership complete, not just in business but in life. I want to be your husband if you'll have me." Harriet looked at the ring gleaming in the last rays of sunset, then at Wade's face so open, so full of love and hope. The fears that had held her back for so long seemed to dissolve in the warmth of that gaze. "Ask me," she whispered. Wade's eyes widened. "You mean?" "Ask me now," Harriet said, her voice stronger. "I'm ready." Wade slid from the porch bench to one knee before her, taking her hand in his. "Harriet Chambers, will you marry me?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will." As Wade slipped the ring onto her finger, Harriet felt a sense of rightness, of coming full circle. She had defended her land alone for 5 years, had proven to herself and everyone else that she could survive on her own. But in accepting Wade's proposal, she wasn't surrendering that independence. She was choosing to share her strength with someone who valued it, who added his own strength to hers rather than diminishing it. Wade stood and pulled her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that promised a future brighter than either could have imagined alone. 3 months later, on a perfect summer day, Harriet and Wade were married in a simple ceremony on their farm. The entire community turned out to celebrate, even Harold Jenkins, who had reluctantly come to respect the partnership that had outwitted him. Mary Miller served as Harriet's attendant, and old Jacob Miller stood proudly with Wade. The ceremony took place under the great oak tree where Thomas was buried, a choice that some might have found strange, but that felt right to Harriet. Thomas had been part of her journey, had helped shape her into the woman who now stood ready to begin a new chapter. After the ceremony, as guests enjoyed the wedding feast spread on tables in the yard, Harriet and Wade slipped away briefly to the hilltop overlooking their land. The fields were lush with growing crops, the repaired barn solid against the sky, the cabin's smoke rising in a welcoming curl. "Happy?" Wade asked, his arm around her waist. Harriet leaned into his embrace, the gold band on her finger catching the sunlight. "More than I ever thought possible again." "You know," Wade said thoughtfully, "when I first rode up to your farm and saw you standing there with that rifle, I never imagined we'd end up here." Harriet laughed. "No, what did you imagine, honestly? I thought I'd be lucky if you let me fix your roof without shooting me." "I considered it," Harriet teased, "but you asked a question that no one else had bothered to ask." Wade's expression turned curious. "What question was that? You asked if I'd ever had help before." Harriet turned in his arms to face him fully. "Everyone else just assumed I needed help, or pitied me for being alone, or waited for me to fail. But you recognized what I had accomplished on my own and still offered partnership, not rescue." Wade's eyes were warm with understanding. "I saw a woman of remarkable strength who deserved respect, not pity, who had built something extraordinary through her own determination. And now we're building something together," Harriet said softly. "Something even better." As they returned to their wedding celebration, Harriet reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years of solitary struggle had given her strength she never knew she possessed. But it had taken Wade Blackwood's simple question to help her see that true independence wasn't about standing alone. It was about choosing when and with whom to share your life. The homestead that had once been her prison, and her proof, now represented something different. A foundation for a future neither she nor Wade could have created alone. Together, they would face whatever challenges came their way, their partnership stronger for being freely chosen by two people who understood the value of independence and the power of connection. And as the sun began to set on their wedding day, casting long golden shadows across the land they now shared in every sense, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that Thomas would be pleased. His dream had not died with him, but had evolved into something new and equally beautiful, a dream big enough for two strong hearts to build upon together.